Cale! Here's Clark. Who? Who's this guy?
Cale, it must be a happy day for you, huh?
Hey friends, this is Cale Clark back with another episode of The Cale Clark Show, and I'm so excited about this one. Been trying to track down this guest for quite a while now with producer Lucas. We were finally able to do it. Going to introduce him in just a moment, but I want to say just before we get started, why not punch the subscribe? Don't punch it, but just tap the subscribe button on YouTube. If you're watching the show through that medium, we welcome you. We're so glad that you're here. Now, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, would ask the favor of a rating. I'm not, some people say automatically give a 5-star rating. I'm not going to say that. Vote according to the quality that you think it is, but it does help people to discover the show. And another way you can help people discover the show too is to, as producer Lucas is laughing at me, just use that send feature as well. You can email your friends, you can text them, and let them share in the joy, right? It's faith, facts, and fun right here on the Cale Clark Show. So let's get started with our new episode right now.
Everybody, welcome back to the Cale Clark Show. So glad to have you with us, whether you're watching on YouTube, whether you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. We've got another fresh episode with a great guest, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. He is a Dominican. I wanted him to feel comfortable, so I wore white today, just in solidarity, and it's so great to have him here. My guest today is a Dominican priest currently based at the Dominican Priory in Oxford, known as Blackfriars, where he serves the Dominican Order as its global promoter general of the Holy Rosary. Loves going on pilgrimage, especially to Marian sanctuaries, travels giving talks, retreats, parish missions, what have you, talking about the Rosary, Our Lady, sacred art, and beauty in evangelization. His photos you can see updated daily on Flickr.com. We're going to tell you more about how you can access them later. He actively promotes beauty and the gospel on social media too, through Instagram, X, and Facebook. And he is also the author of a fantastic brand new book published by our Sunday Visitor Press, OSV. It's called Entering Heaven on Earth, The Signs, Symbols, and Saints of Catholic Churches. My guest today is Father Lawrence Liu, OP. He joins me from the UK. Father, thank you so much for taking the time today, although it's tonight where you are. How are you?
Absolute pleasure to be with you. I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. Well, thank you again for taking the time. Before we get into the book, which, by the way, I thought was absolutely phenomenal, loved it. There's just so much. I could probably interview you for about 10 shows on the content of this book. There's just so much richness there, but we'll do what we can. But before we get into the book, one of the things I like to do with my guests is ask them a little bit about their superhero origin story, if you will.
Okay.
And I know you've got a very unique background. So tell me where you were born and a little bit about your faith journey growing up.
Okay. It's well, I was born in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. Born into a devout evangelical sort of Protestant family. Often if I tell people that I was born to a Brethren family, in America sometimes it doesn't register, but in the UK, people understand that the Brethren were quite Calvinist. This is important because we're talking about an environment when I was growing up where there was no such thing as liturgy. It's a very aliturgical kind of Christian environment. And we worshipped in a bare hall, right? Just a whitewashed room. No images whatsoever are allowed. And that's what I had growing up. I then moved to Singapore when I was about 12 or 13, and I was put into a Catholic boys' school. That's because my mother was a little bit more liberal than the rest of the family, so she wasn't so fixated, I guess, on what kind of school I went to, but she wanted me to go to a good school. And I was sent to a Catholic boys' school run by the LaSalle brothers. And, I set out to tell my classmates that they were wrong and that they were probably, I said to them, actually, are you Catholics? And they said, yes. And I said, oh, well, I'm sorry, I'll pray for you because you're probably going to go to hell.
Whoa.
I didn't make many friends, I think. And
You're trying to look for them, though.
Yes, well, and they said, I said, I'm going to show you that you're wrong and I'm right. So I went to the school library and got out some books. Weird, right? Going to a Catholic school library to get out books, thinking that they would tell me what's wrong with the Catholic Church. But they did the opposite, of course. And I realized, my goodness, actually, the Catholic Church is what I was looking for. I've been looking for the church that Jesus founded and what I call the original church. And it came to me just like that. I read about it, read about the Catholic faith and what the Catholic faith teaches. And I realized, well, this is the church that Jesus founded, then I've got to be a part of it. Now, entering into the 2,000-year history of the church and its, manifold traditions, the presence of the church throughout the world was an exciting thing for me. And so I read voraciously about Catholic traditions, Catholic art, and then encountered the liturgy as something that was truly enchanting, not just because of the scriptures. What pulled me to the Mass was the fact that I could hear the scriptures. I knew the scriptures well from my childhood, and then hearing the scriptures being read in the Mass and in the responses that we gave to the Mass, that was deeply attractive. And I started going to Mass every day from about the age of 14. And one of the teachers encouraged me by giving me a daily missal, so I could sort of read and follow along with the Mass. And before long, I started serving Mass, even though I wasn't baptized and I wasn't Catholic. But I started, very few boys actually went to Mass every day. So the priest had no choice but to ask me to serve. And I served the Mass and eventually became a sacristan. And then I asked to join the RCIA and to become a Catholic. So I was baptized just before my 16th birthday. And my parents were reasonably supportive. I think my grandparents and my more devout practicing Protestant relatives were much more concerned about me becoming a Catholic. But their prime concern, and this is, I think, very instructive, their prime concern is that becoming a Catholic would lead me away from Christ and away from the faith. And so long as I showed, that I kept up my knowledge of the Bible and that I loved Jesus and talk about the Lord, then I think they eventually came round.
Yeah, that's amazing. So have any of your family members from Protestant backgrounds actually become Catholic in the wake of this?
I wish I could say yes, but unfortunately not. I mean, my family, they do watch the things that I do. They've listened to this story, I'm sure, several times because I've shared the links with them.
Yeah.
And they've read my books. I've given them my copies of my first book, which was on the Rosary. They've come to professions, ordinations. It just doesn't seem to be something that they feel that they need to do to convert. I don't think they know what they're missing.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm obviously not telling them enough about the sacraments, but then they'll say they have the Holy Spirit in all its fullness, So
yeah,
I just pray for them. And some of them are also in more complicated sort of relationships, which will make it difficult, I think, to become Catholic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's often a hang up. And a prophet is not without honor, right? Except, as Jesus said, in his own home among his family. Sometimes they're the hardest people to reach. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
And but your desire, I think that's the key. That we just want our non-Catholic friends and family to just experience the fullness of the faith. And one of the places where that happens, obviously, is in the Mass. And I liked how you said, Father, just hearing the word proclaimed in the liturgy. That's, of course, where Scripture, as one author says, goes from written text to living word in the context of the liturgy. And that's obviously, when that happens, it happens usually, if not always, in a church building. And this is part of what your book is all about as well. And I can't wait to talk about that. But I want to just ask you very quickly about how you discovered your vocation to the Dominican order.
Well, I guess after I left university, so I read law in university here in England, and after university, I decided I wanted to become a priest. I felt that God was calling me to be a priest, mainly because I had so much more interest in theology, reading theology, and reading about what's going on in the church, much more than I had in reading legal cases. And but I think that having trained as a lawyer is relevant to why I became a Dominican, and also bearing in mind that as a convert, I spent a lot of my time explaining the faith to my family and my friends, reading about it for myself so that I could explain these things. So having a sort of apologetic stance was always a very important part of my understanding of being a Catholic. And I think that as a lawyer, you learn to make good arguments, you learn to reason well, all these things that I think someone in the order of preachers either needs to have or rather is inclined towards. We are wordsmiths, right? As preachers, we understand the power of words, the power of argumentation, and we seek truth, which is, I think, what a good lawyer, I think, should seek truth. I met too many lawyers who therefore probably weren't very good. And that's probably why I decided not to become a lawyer ultimately. I come from a family of lawyers as well. That's probably why I went to study law. I actually wanted to study theology and church history and Latin, and my father told me that he wasn't going to pay for that kind of education. I should take something that was useful. So I said, okay, fine, I'll study law then. So I had an inkling already, at the age of 17, 18, going to university, that I probably wanted to be a priest. And I promised my father that I wouldn't do it straight away. So I went and studied, finished my degree, and I joined the diocese, which was the Diocese of Leeds in the north of England. And apart from being in a very challenging situation in seminary, which was, how should I say, didn't seem to me to teach the fullness of the Catholic faith. I found that very challenging. And eventually I discerned out. I decided that I didn't really want to live alone in a presbytery or what you call a rectory. Living alone, serving one or two or three churches, I found that a very depressing way of life. And, I admire and I salute all the diocesan priests around the world who are in those situations and who are able to do that. But I just didn't think I could, for my own sanity and for my own sanctity. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to join a religious order, probably. I thought of the Franciscans, actually the Friars of the Renewal. I knew about them and they really challenged me. I decided to take a year out to work in the Philippines and to work in the slums, because I thought, well, if I'm going to take a vow of poverty, which is what I call voluntary poverty, then I at least want to see and experience involuntary poverty. So I lived in the slums and worked with the poor for a year. But whilst I was doing this, I was working with the Dominicans in a Dominican parish in the slums of Manila. The parish is called San Lorenzo Ruiz, named after the first martyr of the Philippines. And in fact, my religious name, Lawrence, was taken from Lorenzo Ruiz. So that's why I'm called Lawrence. I was born and baptized Paul. So I sort of discerned that God was probably calling me to join a religious order. At first, my friends and other priests I knew told me that I should become a Benedictine because I love liturgy, I love singing, I love chant. And I went to one or two abbeys, but it didn't quite feel right. And then one day, I heard the Lord saying to me, I still want you, he said. Because I thought, okay, this is getting so difficult, maybe I should just get a job and do something useful, work in the world. And then I decided to sit in front of the computer and I Googled every single religious order I could think of. And when I Googled the Dominicans, the website of the English Dominicans came up. This was about early noughties, right? Not many websites were available then. So the English Dominican website came up. And when I read the list of characteristics of a Dominican life, it had everything I was looking for. I was looking for all the aspects of observance in monastic life. So the wearing of a habit, choral office, sung divine office, liturgy together in a community, living in a community. But then it had something more, which was basically preaching. The sort of teaching, preaching, correcting, not correcting error so much, but as in leading people from error deeper into the truth, I would say. All that was present. And because of, as I said, about my background and my interest in apologetics, it just ticked all the right boxes. And so I had to give it a go. I asked to meet the vocations director in London, and I sat down at dinner that first night in St. Dominic's in London. I would later become prior of that same place, and and I sat there in St. Dominic's, and at dinner, the conversation I remember was about something about church architecture, and about some other point of intellectual interest, I suppose. I've been very accustomed to churchmen sitting around and gossiping about bishops or priests, or just gossiping. So to hear something that wasn't gossip and actually intellectually stimulating was a revelation. And I thought, I love this. This is much better, And so, I felt at home, I would say. I felt at home. And a priest, a Benedictine monk, had said to me many years before, and I said to him, how do you know that this is the religious order you're meant to join, or this monastery? And he says, well, you just feel at home. And so, yes, there was a sense of homecoming. And I have to say that over the years, my vocation as a Dominican has developed, and I've realized more and more that this Dominican life actually utilizes all the gifts that God has given me to the full. So it's a real living of life in abundance, which whatever talents or gifts I have, I find them all being utilized in a better way than I could ever have imagined. And in fact, falling into photography itself was, entirely providential, I would say.
Yeah, I just love that vocation story and how the specificity of the call, call to religious life, sort of in the general, and then saying the Dominican order is where I need to be, and it's just utilizing all the gifts that God gave me. It's like a hand in a glove. I love that. And also when it comes to, and you were just alluding to photography, one of the things that you've said, and by the way, my guest is Dominican Father Lawrence Liu. You're listening to the Cale Clark Show. One of the things that you've said on one of your websites, on your Tumblr site, is that you view your photography as a form of preaching. And of course, preaching is so central to the Dominican life. Talk about that for a little bit.
Yes, I mean, I often say that, what photography can do is help us to notice the goodness of creation, the goodness of God, the beauty of creation at work. It's a preaching through the radiance of beauty. But beauty is found in being, right? Whatever has being is good and true, and therefore radiates beauty. Following a kind of Thomistic way of looking at this.
Sure.
So I think that even in the most ordinary and mundane of things, we should be challenged to notice the beauty and the goodness of what we're looking at. And what I've discovered is that with the camera, I can do this. Because I notice it. I notice the beauty of the way light plays across the stone wall, for example, or just even the street or your garden. Just walk out and look at the sun as it goes across the grass. And just at the right angle, when it's backlit, the whole thing goes golden. It glows. It's beautiful. And some people say to me, it's just grass. But it isn't.
No.
It's so much more than that. And even if it is just grass, which it is in one sense, we're led to ponder the beauty of every blade of grass, and especially when the dew is on the grass. I love that. It glimmers, it shines and shimmers. It's just really beautiful. So, or I remember my first heavy snowfall in Washington, D.C. It was just after March for Life in 2016, I think it was. And the next day, after the snowfall, it was so powdery and fine. And I went out early in the morning as the sun was rising to walk in the snow. I've never seen so much snow before. It doesn't actually snow that much in England.
Yeah.
And and to have such dry snow as well. It gets wet and slushy here very quickly. And so I walked in the snow, and I watched the sun coming across, sort of shining on the snow. And as the wind blew the snow, it sort of it stirred up the fine snow, and it shimmered in the sunshine, like, I don't know, like dancing fairies, if you want to call it that. It was absolutely beautiful. And although it was very, very cold, I spent a good hour wandering around just trying to capture this beauty, because I think people just don't notice it, right? So that's what I enjoy doing, to showing people the beauty of creation. And as I've written somewhere, also, if I can show to someone the beauty of your face and the beauty of the life that you live, because in our religious life, there's a beauty in the way we interact and the way we do things. If I can reveal that beauty to someone, then I'm really, really delighted. That's what I think photography has the power to do.
Well, I'll tell you what, the book, and by the way, Dominican Father Lawrence Liu has written this incredible book published by OSV, Entering Heaven on Earth, The Signs, Symbols, and Saints of Catholic Churches. And it's lavishly illustrated with your own photographs for the most part. I think almost every photograph is from you, except for maybe one or two. And it's just an amazing tour of so many beautiful churches around the world, and also a tour de force. I mean, not only does it contain incredible imagery, but also the words that accompany those images are also incredibly powerful. I really, really enjoyed the book, and I really want to thank you for writing it. And I did notice actually one particular photo that was in there, and it was actually captured at the National Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis this July. I remember seeing this picture. I said, oh, I wonder if Father Lawrence took this. A couple of nuns talking to a homeless person on the street. And that's an incredible image.
Yes, that was taken. That photograph was taken outside Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yes.
I don't know why I saw it at the Congress, but anyways.
It might have been used. It's one of these shots that has been used in quite a few different contexts. It was the smile on her face, on the sister's face, that really captured me, and such a beautiful, honest interaction, and the fact that I learned from those sisters and from that interaction that when you talk to the homeless, you don't talk down to them, but you come down to their level and talk to them.
Right.
So I spent my diaconate year in Oxford, going out to the homeless on the streets, finding them, talking to them, bringing them hot drinks. That was part of St. Vincent de Paul Society here, and I was just doing that kind of work because I believe that that's what deacons were ordained to do. Right? We were ordained to serve the poor.
Absolutely. And that's an incredible photo. And I know our producer, Lucas Holt, has also made use of your photos in the past. So he was really happy to run into you at the National Eucharistic Congress. Talk about that, Lucas.
Yeah. So I met Father Lawrence and at the Congress, and I'm sure you met a ton of people, Father. So it's probably hard to remember exactly, but I remember looking up, across the sea of people, and I'm like, why does this priest look so familiar? And then it dawned on me, this is the guy whose photos I've been looking at for years online through Flickr. Because when I've done some social media work, and I would always come across your photos, and what I loved about it, and which is what you do so beautifully in this new book, is that it wasn't just the image. There was an accompanying really rich, thorough description of what the symbolism meant, the history of it, and all of that. And so I talked with you at the Congress, and I told Cale, I was like, hey, we need to get this guy on the show and talk with him. And it was also heartening to me that you're in Blackfriars, having spent some time in Oxford myself, and also being a convert. I just find your story inspiring, and so but I think what's so cool too is, and what I love about what you're saying is that photography, especially for young people today, it's such a visual culture that we live in, and I think people especially young people, don't really know what to trust when they see things on the internet anymore, even if it's in a book maybe. Like, what's this person's agenda? And I think where there's the skepticism of truth, a winsome way to evangelize is through goodness and beauty, which so many of your photos capture. And then to give the explanation behind it, it's just kind of this opening up of looking at the faith in a new way, which is really neat. And yeah, and I've been a beneficiary, as Cale said, of a lot of your photos with proper attribution, of course.
No sin was committed in the use of these photos.
Wonderful.
But yeah. So I'm glad we could finally have you on, and it's great to talk with you.
That's great to hear, Lucas. I'm praise God for that. It's all by accident how I say accident because it means that I didn't intend anything much, or what has happened I haven't intended. When I say accident, I don't mean, of course, that it isn't entirely providential. So that's my disclaimer, right? Everything happens according to God's providence, whether his permissive will or his explicit direct will. But I put up these photographs on Flickr. When I was in the Philippines, I opened my Flickr account, and I used Flickr because I was writing a blog about my time in the Philippines, and I needed somewhere free that would host pictures for free. And I was sort of hodling the pictures into the blog using Blogspot at those days, Blogger, right? And Flickr was just a free photo hosting site for me. If you go back, troll right to the first few photographs, that's what you'll find. Photographs that were used and uploaded, and not all of mine are just stuff that I found online, and I shamelessly stole the picture and then uploaded it to Flickr and hot linked it to my blog. That's what it was for. And then when I became a novice, I decided I needed a better camera, and when I joined the order, I said to my dad, if you buy me a camera, firstly, digital cameras means I don't have to spend money on film and developing anymore. Secondly, I knew I was going to Cambridge for my novitiate, and Cambridge has got lots of beautiful buildings, lots of beautiful stained glass windows, which I really enjoyed looking at. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go and photograph these windows. And my intention in photographing stained glass windows initially was to use these colorful images to illustrate PowerPoint slides for children, so I could sort of tell them Bible stories or saints' lives and use these colorful images to illustrate them. Because I was doing that kind of thing in the Philippines, teaching grade 6 students. The irony of it all, the sort of divine humor of it all, is that since taking all these photographs, I have never had the opportunity again to go into a classroom and use PowerPoint slides to illustrate the saints or anything. That's how God works.
That's how God works.
He does this thing to draw you in, but then, you've just got to go with the flow and follow the Holy Spirit, and he will lead it to great pastures, really. And that's what I've done. I just started intentionally putting photographs up every day. And then it began firstly with Saints' Days, and I thought, no, just to fit with the liturgy of every day. And I still do that. I still enjoy the challenge of looking at the liturgy of the day, looking at the readings of the Mass. And now, since 2005, I've been doing it. We're talking about 20 years. Just think of how many liturgical cycles we're going through, and I still find new materials to illustrate the scriptures and to illustrate the lives of the saints. It does mean, though, that I've become a bit of a connoisseur when I go out looking for photographs. So if you tell me that your church has got, I don't know, St. Andrew Kim Taegon, the Korean saints, I would rush there, definitely, because the modern saints are harder to find, especially in Europe. So in the States, there are lots more churches with modern saints, and I love that. And my friends used to say to me, I remember when I went to visit a friend in Detroit, and he said, I don't know what there is to do. There's not much to see. And I'm glad that someone has a dog. At least I think that's a dog.
The Dominicans, obviously, one of the symbols is a dog. I have 2 dogs, so they might act up during the recording. Let's pray not. But go on. You were talking about Detroit.
And he said, I don't know what there is to see. I don't know what you want to do. And it's so easy. Just take me to a church. I don't really
Yeah.
care what church. Just take me to a church, because every church hopefully will have some art, and whether
Mhm.
it's modern art or 19th century stained glass windows, I'm happy to photograph everything. And that's the other thing, right? I'm quite voracious about it. I'll photograph everything and anything, even if I don't particularly like it. I'll still photograph it, because I just feel this need to make a record of the art in the church.
Well,
I have my own preferences, though. I mean, my preference is definitely anything that comes from the first millennium.
I'd have to agree with that. Father Lawrence Liu is my guest, a Dominican priest and author of the new book, Entering Heaven on Earth, the Signs, Symbols, and Saints of Catholic Churches. And Father, even though you may not have had an opportunity to do those PowerPoint presentations to teach, you were certainly teaching and evangelizing through this book. And just listening to you guys talking, and Lucas, what you said about screens, I just want to read a quote from the book and have you maybe comment on it, Father. You say this, quote, "Ours is not a contemplative age, and in our hasty scrolling through a myriad of images on our screens, it is harder to be struck by beauty and purified by it. The ubiquity of images makes even the beautiful commonplace or merely a commodity to be consumed. Tourists and students alike are often found viewing reality through their screens, photographing the art and buildings rather than stopping to look at the art and to truly see. I too am often guilty of this." And then you go on to say this, quote, "Beauty does attract, but what we need is some help to stop and see. Through my photography and through this book, I aspire to help draw people's attention to beauty, to try to arrest their attention so that they can pause and look and see." As the Anglican missionary and painter Lilias Trotter said, "Come and look. My intent is to make you see. Many things begin with seeing in this world of ours," end of quote. And you mentioned also in the book how Bishop Barron, of course, who founded Word on Fire, points out that when it comes to the transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty, with modern people or postmodern people, I guess you could say, you almost have to start with beauty and then move to the good and then move to the true. Can you explain why the order sort of has to be that way to evangelize modern spiritual seekers?
Well, St. Thomas Aquinas will say that that carnal, because we are bodily creatures, right? And because of sin, we find it more difficult to remain interested, shall we say, for the mind to remain elevated to spiritual things, or if you like, non-bodily things. So, if I were just to attract you with truth, that's a spiritual reality, and we would have to do abstract thinking about truth, metaphysics, and so on, right? People find it difficult because we are bodily creatures, and moreover, sin has darkened our mind. So we tend to relate more easily to sensible things, bodily things, corporeal things, as he says. So that being the case, we then have, well, actually, it's Plato, isn't it? And the ladder of ascent. You ascend to love firstly through bodily things. Things which are sensible, things which are closest to you, where you can see and touch and so on. That's how you ascend to beauty. Now, I think that Plato is there describing, what the post-lapsarian world looks like. We're not like angels, so we can't just perceive the beauty of reality as it is. We need to see things through our physical eyes, I guess. And so, because our world is currently in a state where it doesn't like to think,
Yeah.
and it finds thinking hard to be even harder work than it was, let's say, in the Middle Ages. I think that therefore we are very emotive, physical creatures. We rely on our bodies to tell us things. Our bodies and our feelings tell us truth as we know it, my truth. And so we're addicted to using images and sounds and sensual pleasures, really, to draw us into reality and truth. But it's always a subjective thing to begin with. So one of the things I find most challenging is, if I give you an image from the 4th century, let's say, or maybe 6th century, of the resurrection, it's quite, or an icon, for example, they're not sensual as such. They're quite dogmatic. These older forms of art are trying to teach you something. It has a canon, right? A bunch of rules of how you're meant to teach a particular truth about the resurrection. Whereas people will go for the 19th century stained glass window because it's full of color, much more movement, it's much more emotive. And it's a challenge for me if I were to give people a range of images of the resurrection, and they start to choose the ones which I don't incline towards, which are the more emotive ones, the more, well, even the word might be kitsch. I find that difficult. Nevertheless, when I made my first book, Mysteries Made Visible, which is published by Ignatius Press in the US, when I did that book, I gave a rosary prayer group 3 choices for every single mystery, right? 3 different images. And I said to them, you guys pray and then tell me which of these images you want me to reflect on. And I did that so that I would be forced to reflect on images which I wouldn't have inclined towards or chosen myself. Almost invariably, they chose the more modern. When I say modern, I don't mean 20th century, but more 19th century, early 20th century stuff, which wouldn't have been my first choice at all. I like things which have a history behind them. I like things which which are more iconographic. Joseph Ratzinger talks about this kind of thing in a similar kind of way. With icons, you have a canon and a sort of detachment from it because we're just trying to proclaim the truth. The subject of the artist is less involved in an icon. It's the same with music and chant. And, Joseph Ratzinger says that, what happens later on is when the ego or the I of the artist takes over, then we have Mozart and Baroque music and, well, and then the rest of the history of music in the West. And then you have icons and images which become much more, it's more about the artist expressing himself than actually preaching truth. There's an asceticism to art which I enjoy. And I think in photography, part of the asceticism for me, when I'm photographing places and situations, is firstly, I don't tell people to pose. I don't want people to pose. I work around them. I just want to capture the reality of things. And the asceticism is to find beauty in the ordinary. And my Instagram account was actually set up to do that initially. I don't actually use it that way so much anymore. But initially, I used Instagram for the stuff that I saw and just, sort of snapped with my phone.
I love that. We obviously have to find God and beauty in the ordinary. But one thing is, and you love to quote Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger in the book, and rightly so. I mean, he's so brilliant. I miss him so much. But there's a great quote that you have from him, which he gave in 2008 when he was visiting the United States. He was in New York City. And Pope Benedict said this, quote, many writers here in America, we can think of Nathaniel Hawthorne, have used the image of stained glass to illustrate the mystery of the church herself. It is only from the inside, from the experience of faith and ecclesial life, that we see the church as she truly is, flooded with grace, resplendent in beauty, adorned by the manifold gifts of the Spirit. It follows that we who live the life of grace within the church's communion are called to draw all people into this mystery of light. End of quote. And it's so true. Obviously, the church's beauty can really only be understood from the inside. That's true on a lot of levels. The beauty of the teaching of the church can really only be understood from the inside, just as Jesus explained his teachings in private, in Peter's house, if you will, which is kind of a symbol of the church, inside. A lot of things can only be understood that way. And obviously, stained glass windows can only really be understood and seen from the inside. I think it's a great segue to talk about what you do in the book, which is essentially taking us on a journey from the outside, even though obviously the world is charged with the glory and beauty of God everywhere, but the sort of mundane everyday life into this wonderful reality of the interior of the church, exploding with color, exploding with imagery and symbols. I want you to kind of walk us through this a little bit, starting from the outside in. And you do such a great job of this in the book, talking about how churches really communicate, even in their physical structure, this journey of going from earth to heaven. You talk about the entranceways of the church, and even outside the doors, the gardens that often surround those doors. Can you talk about that journey inwards?
Yeah. I mean, my basic premise, right, is that the church building proclaims to all around it and to all who see it, God is here. The dwelling of God is with men, to quote scripture, right? God is here. That's what the church says. And historically, churches had a great verticality or a great presence in the cityscape or in its surroundings, a distinctiveness that would say God is to be encountered here. Even the basilica form, you might say, well, the basilica was just like any other Roman building, or no, it isn't. It was like a great Roman building. And as a basilica, as the name implies, although it's a Greek name, not a Roman name, not a Latin name, it implies this is where the king is, right? And it's beautifully subversive that the Christians appropriated and used the basilical form for their liturgy and for their worship to say, actually, this is where the real king is, the real magistrate, the real judge. It's God present among us in the Eucharist. That's what a church does. And recently I was in Greece on pilgrimage, and I was saying to my pilgrims, we were standing in Delphi, and standing in Delphi outside the temple, or the remains of the temple of Zeus. And I was saying to them, you look at this great temple, right? Inside, it's empty, apart from the statue of the god, which would come out on processions now and again, but otherwise it stays in there. Nobody else goes in. It's a roofed building. Nobody else goes into that roof space except for God, right? For the idol. It is, therefore, the Domus Dei, the house of God in that sense. What's the difference for us, Christians? These buildings are for us to go into. We're meant to go into them because it is there that we encounter God, but also it says something about us. The tabernacle of God is with men because through the indwelling of the Blessed Trinity, which is what is given to us in baptism and through the sacraments, we ourselves are the living temples. We ourselves are the presence of God. And that's why we can go into the temple of the church, because the temple of the church the temples in the past were reserved for gods. Each of us are gods. Therefore, we can enter. We are also priests. We're a priestly people as well. And again, in the old cults, the priest alone, the high priest, the Jewish high priest, entered the Holy of Holies once a year. We can now enter into the Holy of Holies. Although, okay, fine. I also talk about how there's a hierarchy inside. You've got the nave, but then you've also got the sanctuary and so on and so forth. But the basic sense is that, you enter into these temples to encounter God, but also because that is where God dwells, right? Because he dwells in us. And we receive the Eucharist, who is God, who therefore, as you like, divinizes us. He's making us more godlike, more like him. So that's what's happening inside the church. And everything, whether it's mosaics and color and stained glass, all this beauty and stuff is meant to say, this is where God is to be found. And this is where this awesome exchange of, earth and heaven, human and divine takes place here in this church, in this space. That's what it's all meant to say.
Yeah, I just love it. I mean, you talk about how very often outside of a church there'll be a garden. You talk about God dwelling with men, kind of evoking maybe the Garden of Eden, and also the garden in which Christ's tomb was located, and he rose from the dead gloriously. And then how the doors are, as Christ says, "I am the door," and very often doors of ancient churches will have judgment scenes on them. You're sort of passing through death, if you will, into new life, even walking into the church building, and there's just
That's
so
right.
much rich imagery there.
Yes. Sorry. Yes, you did ask about the garden, and there's you've said it exactly. The fact of the garden is because Christ, the risen Christ, is seen and encountered in the garden. And gardens are important in the scriptures. It refers both to Eden, remembering that Adam was the first gardener, to the new Eden, where the risen Lord is encountered as the first, as the new gardener, the new Adam. And it's about the
Yeah.
cultivation as well of virtue. That's what the gardens do.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, we don't see. Well, again, my preferences are for everything that's in the first millennium. So if you look at early Christian churches, or think of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome, for those of you who've been
yeah.
there, it's ideal. You've got a peristyle that's a colonnaded, covered, arcaded thing running around a garden. The garden is divided into four. Ideally, it should have been divided with water, because that represents the four rivers, and that's heaven. All this made its way, interestingly, into Islamic architecture in Spain. People think it's Islamic. Well, no, actually, like so many things which in civilized world, Muslim conquerors came along, appropriated all the civilizations of the Greeks, of early Christians, and sort of just took it up. And I think ignorant people think that, oh, actually, that's that's Islamic architecture or Islamic design. It's not. It's actually appropriated Greek, Byzantine, Christian architecture and design.
Yeah, that's well said. Absolutely. And when talking about these beautiful designs and structures, we get into the church, and obviously in a beautiful church, a beautiful cathedral, we're immediately greeted with color. And one of my favorite sections actually in the book, and I just enjoyed this so much. I was actually reading it to my wife and 8-year-old daughter over dinner last night. We were talking about it. You talk about the liturgical colors that are often used in the vestments. And you mentioned how in our modern age, we kind of take color for granted because of modern textiles and the way we make clothing, chemical colors. We don't remember or think about how difficult it was for people in ages past to actually make the sacrifice to make the church so full of color, number one. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But also, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the colors that were used, especially you talk about for Our Lady. Now, obviously, Our Lady is usually robed in blue. We see this in a lot of artwork, but it wasn't necessarily always the case. Sometimes there's a little bit of red in there as well. Where does that come from?
Yeah, absolutely. The section on color was actually my favorite section to work on, partly because there was a lot of stuff that I didn't already know, and so I had to do some research. And I had some help from a friend of mine who's a fine artist himself. He's not working as an artist, but he saw on Facebook that I was working on this section on color, and he ordered a book on Amazon Prime and had it sent to me the next day. And he said, you've got to look at this, called The Alchemy of Color. And
Wow.
it's one of the things that interests me, because in recent years, I developed an interest in fabric and Japanese dyeing techniques. and,
Wow.
and there's some amazing videos of the kind of complex processes from vegetables and plants, from minerals as well, by which Japanese kimono makers render the dyes that they need. And when I first started looking at this, I thought, this is amazing. How did anyone figure out that plant is going to, through really 20 different steps, you end up with this amazing vermilion or this really, awesome color, which you just doesn't look anything like the plant. How did they figure this out? And it's a dying art. And that's when I started to think about color. We take it for granted. I mean, I use Photoshop to make posters or whatever it is, and you can just pick the color so easily, right? You just type in the code and you get the color you want. But that's not the case at all in the past. And I started to read about this. I mean, I knew about ultramarine or blue being the most expensive color because you had to grind the lapis lazuli and somehow bind it to something in order to make it into paint. By the way, lapis lazuli, we seldom see things painted with lapis lazuli nowadays. But I was in the Prado over the summer, and there's a gorgeous painting by Fra Angelico, the Dominican artist, who's a patron saint of artists, and he painted an Annunciation, and it's been restored recently. But the blue was of the most beautiful blue. And I now realize where that beautiful blue comes from, because the other place I went to over the summer was Greece, as I said, right? And the sea, right? The sea around Greece is of the most gorgeous blue imaginable. And it's the same kind of blue that you find when you grind up lapis lazuli.
Yeah.
And
talk about ultramarine, right? Those blue waters.
It's absolutely gorgeous. And you can see why then they use this most beautiful of colors, this most precious of colors for the Queen of Heaven. It's a mark of love. It's a mark of love. You give to the Blessed Mother, your mother, the best that you can manage, gold and blue, right? And this beautiful Annunciation by Fra Angelico had so much ultramarine in it. And then the wings of the angel Gabriel were just done in gold in this most stunning way. I mean, it was dazzling, literally dazzling. It was just,
It's incredible. Go ahead.
Yeah, and you don't appreciate where these colors come from. But what I really wanted to communicate in this session on color was to say that colors come from inanimate things, right? They come from rocks, and they come from plants, basically. Okay, fine. Purple comes from animals because you got to get it from the mollusk and get the purple dye from them. But generally speaking, it's inanimate things. And that means that the mineral world and the vegetative world are caught up in giving glory to God in the liturgy.
Wow. Because
my point about the church and the liturgy within the church is that you have this cosmic liturgy. In other words, all of the material creation is brought to this one place, to this one point of the liturgy, and all of material creation is transformed and elevated and caught up in the worship of God. Just think of what happens with bread and wine, right? With bread and wine, I mean, wine itself is a miraculous transformation before it's even transubstantiated, right? Just think, it's grape juice. It becomes this glorious thing which reflects the terroir from which it comes. It's a thing of the earth, very much so. But then it then becomes this wonderful drink, which, according to Scripture, God has given us wine to cheer our hearts. Okay, and then this is offered to God, back to God, right? And He further elevates it to this unimaginable peak, and it becomes the accident in which, meaning the external element, in which substantially Christ is present, right? It's amazing. Now, if God does that with wine and bread, what do? We bring ourselves, and God transforms us in our fleshliness, in our humanity, right? He divinizes us. That's what's happening in liturgy. But think then about what else we bring to the liturgy. Lace is just thread, okay? And just getting thread, by the way, from cotton or whatever fabric, linen fabric, That's a long process, just getting thread. But then someone thought, I'm not just satisfied to have thread. I'm just going to work this thread to make this beautiful design. It's crazy, right? And that's, that's lace. You get the same with brocades and
Yep.
damask, all the fabrics.
Mhm.
Then you get that with, metal becoming a chalice or a thurible or whatever it is.
Yeah.
All these various things require great skill. And it's a supernatural thing that's happening, meaning of its own nature, cotton and flax do not become damask fabrics with patterns in them.
Mm.
It needs someone acting upon it to elevate it. It's the same with us. The human being, by its own nature, is not capable of heaven. We need God, but God acting not externally to us, but internally from within, transforming our natures and elevating it supernaturally so that we now going beyond our nature. That's what supernatural means, going beyond
Yep.
our nature.
Mhm.
We should actually be capable of friendship with God and therefore share in the divine life.
I love
So
it.
all the stuff, if you like, all the material stuff of the liturgy is just a reminder of what God is doing spiritually, immaterially, invisibly with our souls. It's
Yeah,
awesome.
it's awesome. That's so well said. My guest is Dominican priest Father Lawrence Liu. The new book, Entering Heaven on Earth: The Signs, Symbols, and Saints of Catholic Churches, published by OSV. Yeah, it's so many things we can unpack there. But I that was really, you said it was maybe the most fun for you to write, that section on color. I loved reading it, and I got to tell you, you scooped me on something, because we've obviously all heard about Our Lady being the Ark of the New Covenant, and obviously preaching and teaching on the Rosary and Our Lady is so important to you. But when you read Luke's gospel, his theological artistry is there, and the scene of the visitation obviously echoes David and the Ark and the books of Samuel and the Old Covenant. But one thing I had never thought of before, especially with regard to color and the color blue being emblematic of Our Lady, is what happened with the Ark in the book of Numbers in a certain color. Tell me about that.
Yes, so we're talking about the veil that covers the ark. And the veil, I mean, again, I was was astounded to discover this myself. I'm not quite sure how I stumbled across it, but yeah, I started to read the scriptures, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is probably why Our Lady is veiled in. There was a movement from associating her with the color red,
Mm-hmm.
which you still see in ancient icons, and they move towards blue, because it's understanding of Mary as the new Ark of the Covenant had emerged, and someone noticed, oh, the Ark is covered in blue and veiled in blue.
That's right.
It's very beautiful. But of course, when you move, I talk about the veil as well, right? So when you go to the book of Apocalypse, in
Yep.
heaven, the Ark is no longer veiled. And
Great point.
that's why I think um, that in certain depictions of Mary, she's not veiled. The Immaculate Conception is the most classic one in the Spanish school, in the Spanish style. But I'm thinking particularly, now today, as we're recording this, it's the 9th of October.
Right.
And for you in America, the 9th of October is the feast of Our Lady of Champion.
Exactly.
And Our Lady of Champion appeared 3 times in I'm going to get the date wrong, 1890 something, I think it was. And when she appeared to Adele Breeze, she revealed herself to be the Queen of Heaven. And although the artists currently depicting the Our Lady of Champion are a little bit more coy about this, meaning they've given her a veil, if you read the descriptions of Adele Breeze, she specifically mentions Mary's free-flowing locks and the color of her hair, golden color, right? In other words, she doesn't mention a veil. She mentions Mary's hair being visible, which suggests to me, now I may be wrong, but it suggests to me that she's unveiled. And I say this in my book. I point it out. And I want artists to take note of this, because this is not a mark of disrespect to show Our Lady unveiled, as some people seem to think, but it actually says two things. One, the Ark of the Covenant in heaven was unveiled, therefore the Queen of Heaven is unveiled. Secondly, an unveiled hair was a mark of virginity. And so I think that these things, and so therefore it's a reference to Mary's perpetual virginity.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So I think we should note these things, because I have had people say to me, it's disrespectful to show Mary unveiled. Well, not necessarily. There might be very good theological reasons for that.
Yeah, and you explain that in the book, and that's a great point about the Feast of Our Lady of Champion and how she appeared to Adele Breeze. That's something that's very, very often overlooked. And thank you so much for explaining that. Just one of the many incredible gems that are in your book. I so enjoyed it, and like I said, Father, I could probably do about 10 interviews with you on this book. It's just packed with so much beautiful, not only explanations, but I think also spiritual encouragement for all of us just reading this. I thought you did a great job preaching through your words of text, and also the beautiful photographs that you shared in the book. So I just want to ask you before you go, how can people find out more about you? How can they contact you online and also get a hold of this book, Entering Heaven on Earth?
I'm easy to find online because I'm a bit of a social media hound. So, if you look for me, Google Lawrence Liu, Lawrence with a W, Liu, Lew. All my sites will come up, hopefully. Go to flickr.com. Flickr.com is, I think, like flickr.com/Paul Liu, very confusingly, because when I signed up for it, I was using my baptismal name, Paul.
Right. I was wondering about that. You pointed that out earlier in the program. So I was like, that's where that came from.
But normally Lawrence OP works, because Lawrence OP is my handle for X or Twitter. Is my handle for Instagram, and also my Facebook page is facebook.com/Lawrence OP. So I've kind of just kept to Lawrence OP as a kind of easy way to find me online. And I'm open to people contacting me through social media, definitely. But I did want to ask you a question, because you
Sure.
read the book, you said, with your 8-year-old daughter. Did you read the section on the unicorn? Because
not yet.
Okay, good. Because
little girls love
unicorns, right? I mean,
she's definitely no exception to that. There's no question about that. So I am. That's definitely on the agenda and on the docket for the next couple family dinners. We're going to get into so much more. And I just, it is such a great catechism. Thank you so much for writing it. Being involved in RCIA programs over the years, one of the things that we always used to do was take the candidates on a tour of a cathedral or even the local parish church and point out all these various facets. And I wish I had your book back then as a guide and to point people towards it. I've never seen anything quite like it. Thank you so much for writing it. You can order this. It's published by OSV, or Sunday Visitor Press, Entering Heaven on Earth, The Signs, Symbols, and Saints of Catholic Churches, by Father Lawrence Liu, Dominican priest. And I love how you're obviously a lot of quotes from Pope Benedict in the book. One of the things he talked about was evangelizing the digital continent. It's so great to see you doing exactly that as well on social media. Father Lawrence Liu, I hope to have you back in the future on the Cale Clark Show. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I know it's getting late out there, so we'll let you retire. And thank you so much for stopping by the show today.
A great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You got it. That was Father Lawrence Liu, Dominican priest, author, evangelist, pilgrimage leader. Contact him online. And as he said, you can just simply Google Lawrence Liu OP, and you'll find most of his social profiles and sites there. So God bless you, Father. Thank you.
Thank you.
Man, that was a powerful episode. I'm so glad Father Lawrence Liu joined us for this look at Entering Heaven on Earth, exploring these incredible churches. And you got to get the book. The book is incredible. It's a keepsake, lavishly illustrated, and just beautiful prose, beautiful. It's really a great catechesis on what a Catholic church building should be like. So once again, hit subscribe on YouTube, give us a rating, You pick the number of stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and go to caleclark.com, C-A-L-E, Clark with an E.com, and you can sign up for the email list there. It's easy, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode of the Cale Clark Show. God bless you.